Tonight, I would like to thank the Great Talk Gold sponsors, the Zach McKinney Group and Morgan Stanley, and LifeBridge Health for their financial support. And a big thank you to the Alexander Grass Humanities Institute at Johns Hopkins University for being our longtime and close VIP partner. Thank you to our media co-sponsors, the Baltimore Fishbowl, J. Moore Magazine, and the Baltimore Sun for their support. We are also appreciative of the donations made by many of our generous supporters. And last but not least, we are deeply grateful to William Eggington, Director of the Alexander Grass Humanities Institute and board member, along with Shira Dingle, his senior coordinator, for their support and graciously offering this Zoom through Johns Hopkins University. Great Talk is an all-volunteer nonprofit organization which depends on your tax-deductible donations to continue to make these programs available for free, like tonight's special program. Donations are always accepted. A recording of this event will be posted on YouTube, and updates of our future Great Talk events can be found on our website, greattalk.org. Tonight's topic is really about the future of our next generation. It's been in the news a lot, but this impressive group will discuss the real issues and their personal experiences with education and the direction it is taking. It is always my pleasure to introduce the director of the Alexander Grass Humanities Institute, William Eggington. He will also be our moderator and will introduce tonight's panel. Thank you and enjoy our talk.
Thank you, Eve. Thank you, Claudine. Thank you, Diane, who can't be here this evening. And thanks as always to Shira Dingle, who makes everything possible. Welcome, everybody, to the first Great Talk of this fall semester. It's a pleasure to be back together again for yet another evening of stimulating discussion about the most important topics of the day. And I have to say, there are few topics to my mind more important than the one that we're going to address tonight. How to educate our children for their best future in a changing world. We have a fantastic panel put together this evening. We have Joshua L. GLAZER, Associate Professor of Education Policy at George Washington University. We're joined as well by Rain Pryor, an entertainer, writer, director, playwright, educator, and activist. We have a student in our midst as well, Oliver Song, a student rights advocate, environmentalist, and activist, and as well CONOR P. Williams, a senior fellow at the Century Foundation and a researcher and writer covering educational equity and school diversity. So I'm going to begin this conversation with an opening question to all of our panelists. I'm going to moderate the discussion for a little while with some follow-up questions. But don't forget that you're here to discuss this with us as well. So after the panel's had a chance to go on for a little while, I'm going to open up to questions from the audience, and you can use the Q&A function in your webinar to send me questions that I will then pass on to the panelists. They'll be able to see them too, and I will try to direct the questions that I think are going to continue our discussion to the best degree possible. So panelists, I'm going to begin with this question. I think most people today would acknowledge that we're in a period of crisis as regards our education system. Underpaid teachers, understaffed schools, soaring levels of inequality between public and private, and even among public schools. So to start, I'd like to ask each of our panelists to make a case for what the single most pressing concern is and how they think best to address it. Do I have a volunteer? Who would like to start off? Rain, how about I start with you?
You know, to me, thank you, by the way, for having me. One of my focal points, one being an educator, also having a teenage daughter who's now attending Baltimore City Public School, even though it's for the arts. For me, it's really about proficiency in math, proficiency in English, the proficiency in academics in total. And I think we have to kind of focus more with our students and our educators, not piling on so much of our teachers to teach to test, but to actually teach so that the kids are actually absorbing and learning, and to understand that each child definitely is individual, and within that create curriculum around that that will support them so that they can learn better and obtain the information better.
Very, very well put. Let's have another one of our panelists enter in. Oliver, as a student, what perspective do you bring to this conversation?
Thank you so much for having me. It's amazing to be here tonight. I think when I think of some of the challenges that education comes across, I think not of, I guess, a single issue, but kind of a network of different level tier issues that come from both the local and then national, and then kind of a systemic point of view. I think based on the local view, which is kind of where my experience comes from, because I recently did graduate from high school, there are a lot of conversations that need to be had, for instance, about things such as school discipline, as well as looking critically at our higher level classes and what type of student or who or what demographic are in those classes, and what, if anything, schools can do to kind of bridge that opportunity gap to make it more accessible for other students to access those courses. And then at the federal level, we are also working with issues such as book banning and other curriculum restrictions that different regions are imposing. And then also at the systemic level, which kind of channels in from the lower level of students do not feel, I guess, they're in an environment which is conducive to learning. And that can partially be attributed to things such as not relating to the curriculum or being taught to the test versus being taught to learn. And I think those are all kind of issues that when stacked together form a greater picture versus kind of this one exact thing that we need to focus all our efforts on.
Understood. Thank you, Oliver. Connor, how about from your perspective?
Well, it's a tough question to answer. I'm tempted to get my sort of old man hat out and complain about ed tech and screen time. But I think that I want to answer instead that I don't think that we're in a new crisis in public education or in education more generally. I think that we're dealing with things like screen time and ed tech are sort of easy to notice because they feel new in the ways that they're manifesting. We could talk about AI. We could talk about data privacy and elevating things to the class, any number of different things that are new in education. But the truth is that American public education in particular, and American education more generally, are systemically deeply biased, and they have been always. So if we have a crisis now around inequality of outcomes from kids, which we do, it's the same crisis we had 20 years ago. It's the same one we had 30 years ago. It's the same one we had 50 years ago. And one of the great fallacies in my work, and the people that I spend around a lot of time arguing with, is that we had this notion that at one point, American public education was doing something so great and so amazing, and that there was a Shangri-La moment when we had solved the problem, and then it's since fallen apart because of, and you can pick your boogeyman, pick neoliberal this or corporate reformers that, or that somehow we've fallen away from the one true path we were once on with public education, when the reality is, it's a public good. It's something that we provide as a system, which means it's universally made available as an entitlement, roughly until 18, in some states 20 or 22 years old, except that we also allocate it according to resources, usually the housing market. And of course, if you think that the American housing market is just a neutral territory, entirely fair, that where resources are evenly taken seriously and it's generally allocated well, there's no systemic bias or racism there, then I have lots of things I want to sell you in the real estate market because you clearly don't know how it works. The point being, American public education and American education more generally is still suffering from the same crisis that it's been suffering from since it began to be a public education system.
All right. Opening up a lot of issues there. Joshua, you want to follow up?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and thank you very much for having me. Just delighted to be here and be part of this panel. Yeah, agree with a lot of the things that were said, and particularly what Connor was saying just now. You know, this era did not invent inequality or unequal outcomes. We did not invent this sort of politicization of education and a lot of the other issues that we're dealing with now. But I'd like to strike a little more optimistic tone. And I think that actually we've made a lot of progress. It's true that our system has inequality baked into it in the way that Connor said. That is for sure, and that part of that is the design of our system and how sort of tied it is, as he said, to the housing market and local control and the way we fund schools and so forth. But we are talking about inequality now more than we ever did before. If we were having this conversation just when I was in high school in the 1980s, nobody was talking about inequality. We didn't even really know the extent of unequal outcomes because we weren't checking, and nobody was sort of being held accountable for that. And folks weren't banging their heads against the wall trying to figure out what we do about that in schools like they are now. Now, it is definitely true, we have not solved this problem, and there's a lot of very important work to do and many, many things that could be better, but at least it's on the agenda. At least now we sort of accept the notion that schools should be trying to produce both rigorous and equal outcomes. That's a relatively new idea. And I think we just got to keep that in mind, that we're still trying to sort of figure out something which just a few decades ago was not part of the conversation.
How about that, Oliver, Rain, Connor? This idea that maybe even noticing the problem is already a step in the right direction. Rain, I saw your hand go up.
Well, I was going to say, yeah, noticing the problem definitely is a step in the right direction. But if if I go back to when I was in school, the school culture was absolutely different. You went to school, you were there to be educated, and there was very low tolerance in terms of behavior, and it didn't matter what your socioeconomic background was, so it seemed, right? You were just expected to learn and expected to achieve and obtain the information and really go off and to greater education of some sort, or have a skill by the time you left school. And I feel like, nowadays, even though we can call this stuff out, what are we going to do collectively to actually put into place equal, I don't even want to say equal justice, but equal opportunity and advancement for our students to compete in a global stage? That's where we're headed. We need to think about their future completely different than when we were coming up. There's computers involved, there's AI, there's new technology. How do we implement those new technologies into what they're doing now that it will propel them forward, and especially in a global market?
Well said, and an excellent point. I'd like to actually go back to Connor, because there's something, Rain, that you're saying that raises a question about what Connor was saying before. Connor said that, look, often we think about a time when things were better, and then, right, we criticize the current moment in comparison with that. And in fact, I think, Rain, what you're saying is that, at least in your recollection on the question of behavior and sort of the minimum standards of behavior in the classroom, you are seeing a difference, and it hasn't gone in the right direction. Connor, do you have a sense of, are there numbers to attach to this? Is this something that we can quantify in any way, or the fact that many of us feel that there's this difference not really refer to anything?
Well, on student behavior, I don't know that we have any kind of comparable data across generations. I think everybody's living in their own anecdotes on that. And that isn't a bad thing. It's just, I just don't think we have standardized data that can speak to that I'm aware of. I mean, academically, we have, I think, pretty solid evidence to Dr. Glazer's point. And I would say, I think we're in agreement. I think it is good that we're acknowledging the reality that it should matter if kids are or are not meeting standards that we as a collective set for them. That is new, and it is big, and it's important. It's been a fight over decades. Gosh, I mean, it was only 10 years ago that we were having a debate over whether the Common Core standards were going to involve UN troops and retinal scans and all sorts of other conspiracy theories, just to get everybody to agree that basic algebra things needed to happen in 8th grade, right? I mean, it was an immense political fight to get us to where we are. But the question wasn't what progress we're making. The question was, right, what's the crisis? And I think the crisis is still systematically that core inequality. And let me put a finer point on it, especially for those attending. If you've ever heard or told someone that you moved to a neighborhood or to a town or to a school district for the schools, that's what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is, can you afford school choice for you? School choice that involves a mortgage of hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars, and you move there for the community and for the schools. But your building community and moving there for the schools is another person's, I can't afford that. It's just not for me. And in our system, in every state in the United States, there are some that allocate resources more progressively, and there are some that try to rectify that housing imbalance on the back end by making school funding more equitable. But at the end of the day, that's what we're talking about everywhere, is that we have this public good, and some people can afford a version of school choice where they pay for it up front. and they get something much nicer than what everybody else can afford. And this is personal for me, not only because I have 3 kids and they're in Title I public schools here in Washington, D.C., but also because I'm a kid who grew up in highly dysfunctional public schools in a place that no one moved to for the schools. And we couldn't afford anything else. There was no other choice. There was no just roll up your shirt sleeves and make it better. It was just a really kind of crummy situation. And look, for me, for a white kid with 2 parents who were first-generation college graduates, we had some cultural capital kicking around the house. It was enough. I got out. It was okay. Everything was fine. For my peers who didn't have some of the privilege that I was able to build on, it wasn't good enough. So that's it's what keeps me up. Your question was, I mean, I think we do have some academic progress evidence. We can say, yes, that schools have gotten better, that kids at younger ages are doing more challenging work than they maybe were 20 or 30 years ago on the whole, and they're doing better at that work. But there's so much more to do.
Yeah. But that's already really interesting that there is data on that, on learning outcomes, and that you see improvement in that data over the stretch of time, specifically back to a kind of halcyon age that others might have, and from the anecdotal perspective, been looking back and saying things were better then. And your numbers actually seem to be saying, well, that's actually not the case at all. If anything, we have some improvement there. Oliver, any follow-up from you?
I guess kind of a side note that's complementary to the discussion is, I guess schools based on my experience, are kind of thinking very carefully about, in addition to achieving academic standards and proficiency in math and reading, also preparing students for a life that may not involve college. Because for many of our students, college may not be the place that they want to go. It might be for personal reasons, might be for financial reasons, it might be just simply they want to attend trade school or enter the military. And I think that schools are gradually beginning to realize that it's kind of a yes and situation. It's not either achieve reading proficiency and math proficiency or start learning how to be in the workforce. It's kind of, well, how can we simultaneously develop both of these elements? And in my high school, Wild Lake High School, the administration has this program called Find Your Purpose, Create Your Path, where every student is encouraged to think about where they want to take their high school career, what they want to do after high school, and connect what they're learning and what they're doing in both extracurricularly as well as in the school to how they can, move past high school into their future. And I think that's an important conversation that we should also be having in addition to achieving standards, because it's kind of like a 1 + 1 = kind of the full picture.
Yeah, like what are the standards for, right? And in fact, that actually segues beautifully into one of the questions that I wanted, the next questions, my follow-up questions that I wanted to ask the entire panel, to think about what is the ultimate purpose of education? Now, before we all immediately say, well, duh, it's obviously to learn stuff, let me specify. In a big sense, right? Should, and this comes directly, actually, Oliver, from the point that you were making, should schools aim at an all-around liberal arts education intended to mold cultivated citizens? Or should the focus be on preparing for jobs, on thinking about economic outcomes? Because, those sorts of issues are actually going to lead, in some cases, to life or death. What do you all think about that? Josh, why don't we start with you this time?
I'm happy to start, but I would you allow me to respond to something Connor said earlier? Or is that
Please, absolutely. There's no rules here.
Yeah. No, look, his point about do you have the money to locate in a neighborhood which has good schools is obviously a very important point and a reality and a major source of inequality in the system. But public education will not solve the larger problem of social and economic inequality, certainly not by itself. That's not a realistic expectation. There are too many other factors involved. One of the things that's happened over the last several decades is that affluent parents are just pouring resources into their kids, socially, culturally, experiences, summer camp, music lessons, tutoring, you name it. And there's just no possible way that poor families or the school system can possibly offset that. So even as poor people and communities of color have started to do better, the gap widens because of how much resources affluent families are just investing in their kids' education and their social and economic opportunities. But schools still can do a lot of things, and they can do a lot of things better. And I'm just going to sort of double down on what I said before and add a few comments. Connor said, it took a long time to sort of get the Common Core accepted, and he's absolutely right. But that is an enormous accomplishment. I mean, the notion that we're going to have states that are going to sort of try to insist on intellectual rigor as the status quo across all their schools. It's just a monumental change. But one thing that happened when states adopted either the Common Core or Common Core equivalent is that they immediately discovered their entire system lacked the capacity to meet those Common Core standards. Teacher training lacked the capacity, leadership lacked the capacity, professional development lacked the capacity, certification, curriculum, nothing was sort of set up in a way that would allow the system to sort of promote and sustain and accomplish teaching and learning at a level which was orders of magnitude higher than what it replaced, unless you were from Massachusetts, Maryland, or a couple other states. I did a lot of research in Tennessee. When Tennessee adopted the Common Core, I mean, it was an absolute earthquake for that system. You're not going to make those changes. You're not going to be able to teach teacher education, leader education, professional development, the inner workings of schools, practice in classrooms. You're talking about tens of thousands of classrooms that have to do things differently. That's not an overnight change. That's not a year change. That's barely a decade change. That's an intergenerational project.
Oh, absolutely.
And at least we're involved in it. So if you ask me, what is the biggest threat or the biggest crisis? The crisis would be if we take our eye off that ball. If we lose sight of that goal, if we throw in the towel or go off in another direction, that we sort of our commitment to that agenda weakens, through either a short-term perspective or other issues which tend to sort of distract us, political things. We've got to keep our eye on that ball. That's a long-term project. We're asking a huge, fractured, disjointed system to just do things that we never asked it to do before. And there's a little bit of an element that we just kind of have to be patient. And I know that doesn't feel good when you're in the midst of it, when you have kids or you're a student yourself and things just don't seem like the way they should be and the quality is not there. But my view is, we just got to stay the course.
And one little footnote to what you were saying, just an intensifying footnote, is not only the differences between, say, Tennessee and Maryland, but within Maryland between Baltimore and Frederick, or Baltimore and Potomac, Maryland.
Look, I did spend a lot of time doing research in Memphis. Memphis has a lot of things in common with Baltimore and, say, Detroit or New Orleans. If you look at the numbers, just the proficiency rates Rain was talking about earlier, they don't look great. But if you're inside that system, I wasn't inside it, but I was observing it closely, you see a lot of really talented people working really, really hard, trying to figure out, how do we do this different? How do we teach algebra to kids that don't know how to multiply? How did we deal with, provide real educational rigor and opportunity for kids who come from extremely challenging circumstances? And working really hard to figure that out. Does it show up in proficiency scores? Not really. But there's still folks in play, even in those cities and schools in Baltimore that you mentioned, that are, again, not perfect. I don't want to sort of romanticize it, some of the problems or sweep them under the rug, but there are people in these places really working hard to figure out, how do we do things differently than we have for most of our history?
Any follow-ups on from the other panelists about the points that Josh is making? Let me just add to that as well, and then I want to go back to the question that I had wanted to get to, and I really still want to get to that. But this question, Josh, of the going in the right direction, to what extent, I'm wondering, and everyone else can jump in as well, but that crisis moment that I referred to in my opening question that we're seeing right now, in particular, one of the elements that I mentioned was massive teacher shortages. Right, that's maybe a blip that's more than a blip. Is this going to create headwinds that are going to really cut into the kinds of progress that Josh is talking about? And is that something that we want to focus on as well in our conversation? But let me get back to that big question, because that's a big philosophical question as well. Oliver brought it up in the points that he was making. What do we see as the ultimate purpose of education? Is it something deeper than creating, and I don't want to say this in any kind of a deprecative way, right? Creating better performers at an economic level. I mean, that's important too. Poverty, getting rid of poverty it should be one of the aims of education, but should an education system be aiming for something beyond that? Is there something to the idea of a liberal arts education that is worth salvaging, or, is that really only
I think it's a both ands, I
Yeah,
think
tell me
you can
about
have
that.
liberal
Yeah.
arts and I think you can have vocational as
Mhm.
well. I think what we're seeing now, especially if you look at where America is
Mm.
in terms of its progress economically, where we're headed, what's happening, that we have to bring back our vocational training if we want a market that will even buy what we have and keep some of those institutions going. At the same time, we also need the art thinkers. We need the business minded, the ones that might actually go to Harvard. I think an example just for myself is, my daughter's is at an arts curriculum school, but yet
Baltimore School for the Arts, I assume.
Baltimore School for the
Great
Arts,
school.
and it is a great school because the focus is on education. It happens to be a longer day, but then it's also the arts. And it's not necessarily that those students are going to go on to be famous artists, famous dancers, famous actors, famous musicians, but they're also opening and expanding avenue of choice so that you could be a music professor, you could be someone who studies art history, who teaches art history. So there's different avenues, or some people who are in the visual arts have gone into medicine. So like it's about expanding, opening the door of opportunity. And that's what we have to look like, especially in areas where the socioeconomics doesn't meet how I grew up. I got to travel the world, I got to see things, and that is rare for someone who's African American, in America, that is.
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't have that, how do we broaden those horizons for different socioeconomic groups to be able to have privilege,
Right,
and to see things and to grow artistically and vocationally? You don't have to eliminate one for the other.
Absolutely. One point that Danielle Allen has made before is that there's research out there that says liberal arts education can have a direct impact on what she calls participatory readiness at the level of forming citizens, right? That those who have actually taken, as opposed to really focusing exclusively, for example, on STEM or even vocational training, those who actually take a curriculum that involves reading and thinking about big ideas, civics obviously is gonna impact this as well, creates an educational group that's more prepared to actually engage in civic discourse. And I'm wondering, since one of the points, Oliver, that you brought up was precisely about divisiveness, was about politics and education, if that might be some point that we're at that's rather different right now than it was in the mid-century and the two-thirds of the way into the 20th century, namely the degree of political divisiveness that we've arrived at, and whether public education has something to do with that. I mean, not to mention that it's reverberating back on education right now with book bannings. So what are your thoughts about that?
I definitely think that it's kind of this self-contained cycle, and I guess I can explain more about that later. I think fundamentally schools should serve as vehicles to equip students with the habits of heart and mind to serve as engaged and informed citizens, just as you said. And engaged could be any type of self-fulfillment that they just deem fulfills their needs. That could be, for instance, teaching art. That could be becoming an economics professor, doing business, or anything basically that's anyone finds to be self-fulfilling. I don't think it has to be a certain way. We shouldn't be specifically focusing on producing engineers or biologists or any sort of things like that. And I think that the engaged and informed piece is really critical, because I think that we are seeing increasingly in our politicized environment that there are people who obviously do not know things that they probably should, do not know how to accurately fact check sources, do not know how to accurately look at all perspectives. And I think that that kind of freedom to look at different sources, to kind of question what you're receiving from all sides, is something we're losing in public education. We're losing it at the high school level, we're losing it at the college level, to echo chambers, to social media. And I think that fundamentally, as this gets worse, it will self-enclose on itself. The more polarized become, the more faster we will become polarized. And I think that the era that we are in now is a time for us to kind of stop that cycle, for us to keep that channel open, for us to question critically, what we are learning and who we are hearing from and what we think and why we think what we think. And I think that this is an important crossroads for that.
It's a really good point, but not to be too much of a downer. If the issue is precisely as you're saying, there's a kind of circularity to it, where do you actually intervene? If education is being divided by the very divisiveness that education is helping to produce, where does the intervention happen? How do you actually step in and stop that kind of a cycle, do you think? And Oliver, you can jump back in, and anyone else as well.
It's definitely a hard question, and there isn't kind of like this hardline solution that we have. But what I think is, I think of multiple levels. I mostly think of things as kind of multiple different areas for us to focus at. At the school level, teachers can be more open to having forums for discussion for things such as civics, for things that in the right place and time and environment, they could talk about things that for now we see as extremely polarized, and open that kind of discussion. At the college level and even at the curriculum level, I think people who support the ideal of education, of free expression, of conversation should fight to keep those spaces free, to fight those bans, to fight those curriculum restrictions. Because as soon as we start doing that, we restrict perspectives that students see. And when we restrict perspectives that students see, it feeds into that same feedback cycle. So there are actions that local people can take, there are actions that our state, federal boards can take, and then certainly there is stuff that we can do as a person, as someone who maybe not be a student or a teacher, to kind of ensure that that doesn't keep happening.
Very good points. One thing I'd like to add in there, and then hear from the rest of the panel on this very important question of limiting access of students to materials that's been happening as a result of ideological intervention into the education system. And Oliver, this also goes directly to your point, but also perhaps in a problematizing way as well, is when we talk about empowering communities and empowering parents to make themselves heard. In some ways, that's also been a lot of the cause of the problem recently. I just think today across my desk, this came. I have a cousin who's working in a school district up in New England, who was just telling me today that the superintendent of her district is getting threats from parents who are saying, "Hey, why are you intervening in the sports teams?" Well, she had to, and the reason she had to intervene was because of Title IX violations, that boys football teams were having more coaches because of a bunch of parents who wanted to be volunteer coaches. So she said, "We're going to have to cut this out. The volunteer coaches need to be withdrawing so that we can have equity." And she's now getting threats because it's then passed on into the greater kind of blogosphere, and people are starting to express their concerns and their anxieties and their anger directly to her. So in other words, often the feeling of empowering people to express themselves ends up in this current situation as impeding on other people's rights.
I mean, look, this goes back to where I was starting, right? And I think you've alluded to this. Part of why that's happening is that we're tolerating so much separate but allegedly equal education, right? That the view of one community from what they want out of their schools, the view of another community is not going to be often not going to have a lot of overlap. They're not going to be identical. And then what little diversity you may have in those communities suddenly starts to spark the problem, where the majority view is the football team is the most important part of our school. And if somebody does anything that calls that into question, then it erupts. I mean, I guess I would just keep pushing on what I said before. I think that we can't excuse the inequality in our schools and how we allocate access to schools by saying that it wouldn't solve everything, right? Mm-hmm. And not least because it's the same answer for climate change, right? That your hybrid's not relevant because climate change is well beyond any individual choice you make. So, don't worry about it. And also, move to the suburbs for the better schools. It's no big deal. It doesn't really matter. The inequality is too big for schools to solve. But I think what we're acknowledging in this subsequent conversation, right, is that actually it does matter. It does matter whether schools are, in fact, engaging at all with the broader work of sorting out what their community wants schools to be. It does matter whether schools are, in fact, so wildly different from one another and so wildly unequal that, for instance, one of the premises of your question a minute ago, that economic well-being and getting a job and having academic rigor are sort of in one category, and that the good life, the liberal arts, and the broad curriculum are in another one. I mean, as a product of a liberal arts college, I can say that it has always, I believe, been part of the good life, right? That the economic oikonomia in the ancient Greeks, right, is very much a part of the fully rounded city and the ideal point for any education, philosophical or otherwise. That dichotomy just can't be allowed to hold. But again, it's the kind of thing that I think that can hold once you've let the school system not just mirror, but in fact amplify the divisions that inequality is producing. So again, this is why I don't think that anybody should let themselves off the hook on the choices that we make about schools. Whether we've chosen to leave the city where we work or the city where we used to live, to now that we have kids, we've got to get out to Montgomery County, we've got to get out outside of the city to make sure that we're in those schools, because again, we moved here for the schools. We're just so proud of them. And we believe in public education. That's why we're here. Mm-hmm. That can't be excused by saying that our choices aren't enough alone to solve it. You have to make the just choice anyway, if in fact you want to claim that you care about justice. And so, and again, I think that's the beginnings of the solution. But to bring it back to also the, the more urgent issue around civics in the moment and around critical thinking that Oliver was talking about. I mean, that's one of those things I worry about this in my work, because, if you're thinking in the policy research space, it is two things can be true at the same time. It is absolutely the case that better civics education that teaches young students now to more thoroughly and critically engage with American history is the solution, right? Having people who actually know how things have come out the way they are, that's definitely not just some of, it's most of the solution for our problems. It's also a 50-year project, and the problem is yesterday, right? Like, we don't have time for that solution either. And we also don't have the governance system to deliver it. So I don't know. I think it's one of those things, like, it could be true and it may not actually be enough, something we can actually do.
Mm-hmm. Really good points. Josh, did you want to follow up on that?
Yes, I'll try to. A lot of good and perceptive points. Well, I guess as I'm listening to what Connor and Oliver and Rain were saying, I'm reminded that schools are public institutions. They are highly sensitive and tied to public opinion on a local level. Often things that we might not like what we see, for example, what Oliver was talking about, and I think, William, your original question was, why have we moved away from a liberal arts curriculum in favor of things that may seem more utilitarian, about getting to college, about getting a job, about economic success, and forgotten some of those loftier aims? Well, one of the reasons is because that's what people want. The schools are very much driven by public sentiment. So, Oliver was saying, hey, well, or you asked Oliver, how do we intervene in this? And when Oliver was talking about it, I was thinking, well, if I could make a suggestion, it would be intervene among your peers. You all will, as you get older, some of you will have kids, you'll have families, you'll be stakeholders in the system. And I think what Connor was saying is those private decisions that thousands and thousands of people are making really are the most powerful force in the system. So if we believe in a more liberal arts curriculum, then we have to demand it. Schools do respond to public opinion. They essentially have no choice because of our sort of system of local control. I would just add one more thing, William.
Please do.
Take your example about your, I think you said your cousin or your
cousin of mine, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Cousin in New England, where I'm from also. Mm. And the principal was under a lot of pressure and heat about decisions around Title IX. So here's a positive spin on that anecdote. Mm. Schools are one place where big issues can still be debated on a local level. Mm-hmm. Mm. Where complicated and yes, divisive, but meaningful topics are discussed, where the disagreements are had, where we pull back and forth. And sometimes in the midst of it, we can all get worked up about our side and feel that the other side is being unreasonable. And why would you say this to the coach? And of course, Title IX is important and so forth and so forth. But those are important conversations to be having. And we don't really have a ton of public platforms in this country where we can have those debates. Maybe if someone had asked me how to design public education in the US, I would not have chosen the system that we had and perhaps would not have, definitely would not have created a system so rooted in local control, which, as Conor's been pointing out, has been a recipe for massive inequality. But that's what we have, and barring a change in the Constitution, that's what we're going to continue to have. So at least sort of one silver lining in that system is that these questions can be important topics for public discourse. We should be debating this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Could I add one thing?
Please do.
I think part of what you were saying, Dr. Glazer, is also, well, who are stakeholders, right? I think it's also important to consider that the loudest people in the room are often not the people who are directly impacted by some of those policies. And I'm speaking about students specifically. I think we are, again, this is kind of a crossroads, because I think students around Maryland, around everywhere, are starting to kind of slowly realize that they deserve to have a voice at the table when it comes to things such as education and what they're learning. And that could be present in some ways through the presence of a voting student member, which across the nation, many students are fighting for the presence of such a person. And in other ways, it's just students being active to kind of testify, to share their opinion, to tell the adults or the people in power in the room what students think about the issue. Because we have all this stuff from parents, coming from parents, we have the stuff coming from the teachers union, which is also really nice, but where are the students' voices? What do they think? And I think oftentimes there may be a discrepancy between what students see, what they experience in school, and what the perceived perception of that school is from maybe parents or from an outside force. And I think that one thing that school systems should definitely be looking at is how to engage students in their decision making, how to see what they think, because after all, the students are going to be at the end of the receiving end of those policies, those decisions, and thus should deserve a voice to have a say in them.
That's a terrific point.
But for myself, even hearing this conversation, I think that's we're still, I mean, most of us on this panel seem very privileged to have the types of education that we had. So then how do we focus that and trickle that down to the parents and that don't have access, the students that don't have access, that know they can have a voice, that know they can have an opinion in the rooms that are, you know, changing curriculum at their school. We don't have that. So that's where, like, for me, that's where a lot of my focus is how to reach those kids and those families. Because those are the voices we need to be hearing from, because those are the kids that are being impacted at this moment, especially here in Baltimore City. It's very clear, you know.
So much of what we're talking about and pointing our fingers at, as several of us have said, I know, Conor, you were making this point on several occasions, really has its root in socioeconomic inequality in this country. And of course, and Josh, what you were just saying, that the local control of our schools is we're not going to change that unless we go back and change the Constitution. And that did jog my memory. I mean, there have been some well-established court precedents, right, where I think on the basis of the 14th Amendment, inequality in public education has been actually brought to task. And in many states, I think entire state funding systems for education have been found unconstitutional, and school districts have been ordered to do something about it. So in some sense, the legal system is, from time to time at least, trying to go after the root cause. Is there any progress on that? Are we getting anywhere?
I mean, yeah, right. But I don't want to be cynical. I do want to make sure we say that when we talk about the inequality that's baked into our society and that we're amplifying with our schools, that we don't just call it socioeconomic, that it's racial too, deeply racial and racist, really. But what I would say is that, look, like, we've had legal wins and we've had legal losses. Those of us who are pursuing civil rights and equity for all kids. The famous version, right, is Brown v. Board, where there are these legal wins that create a brief opening where there's some progress towards better integration of schools. There's a couple of subsequent court cases which double down a little more, and then in some places it gets really implemented, and then basically we kind of shrug and we say, man, that's really hard, we're just not going to do it. And there's a lot of cases like that. Let me give you one from my actual research too, right? I do a lot of work on English learner students who speak a non-English language at home and who are beginning the process of learning English through the US school system. Historically, these students have been heavily protected by standardized tests, because when there's some kind of external to the school benchmark to check then it makes it much harder for the school to say, okay, everybody named Rodriguez or Hernandez or Garcia, you guys all go in the ESL class. Like actually checking to see their language needs with some kind of standardized test ends up being a real safety valve to make sure that these kids don't get abused. And yet, even though we've built a whole system under No Child Left Behind and subsequent efforts since to do that, I was in a extremely blue city, in an extremely blue neighborhood, very progressive, in a public pre-K center, where a lady explained to me, oh, yeah, we have this dual language program, and we just put the kids with the right last name. They just go into that one. I remember thinking, like, this is a flagrant civil rights violation. And this lady was a out and out lefty. She was, if I had asked her how she felt about civil rights, about how she cared about socioeconomic inequality, how she cared about justice, she would have cheered. She would have led the parade. And yet it was totally instinctive to her. Fine, yeah, we'll just do it that way. Right? We don't need to check what languages they speak. Last name, we'll just throw them in there. I have limited faith. I think that it's important to bring court challenges and then the win when it occasionally happens via the court system, because we should acknowledge that also the courts have done things like San Antonio versus Rodriguez, right, which enshrined local property taxes as a okay funding formula that could be used as a justification, in essence, for what's de facto inequality in the way we fund schools. But the court wins that we have are only they're like the very first of steps before we do all of the hard work that we almost never do after we win these court cases.
Right. Really good points. Look, I don't want to ignore the fact that we have at least one very active and interested audience member who's been throwing some questions our way. So Linda, I want to start with the first question that Linda asks, and I think this was, Josh, perhaps largely in response to something that you said about being patient. Is there a way that we can do short-term things while you're waiting for the long-term project? That's a lot of kids that aren't going to get what they need. And she adds, she doesn't think that's a responsible policy. So thoughts about kind of the long-term versus the short-term. What do you think?
Well, she's right. And I would rephrase her statement as saying easy for you to say. She's right. And there are short-term things that we can be doing, things that might cost some money, but the implementation is a little bit easier, such as adding an extra time to the school day, such as, strategic allocation of teachers to kids. Let's make sure that the kids who have the greatest instructional needs get the most experienced and qualified teachers. Those can be sometimes in the sort of micropolitics of schools challenging to do, but they're doable. Where I would respectfully just push back a teeny bit from the audience member, and it's a perfectly good point, is that sometimes schools that work in high poverty areas, they can be very chaotic places. There are a million fires to put out all the time, and the sense of urgency can be overwhelming. And that often comes from a good place, because as the commentator noted, these are kids here whose lives are sort of on the line educationally. But we just have to be careful that we're not so overwhelmed by short-term goals and by the urgency of the moment that we forget about the long-term capacity building, long-term shifts in instructional practice, leadership practice, organizational schools that ultimately are really what are going to make a difference. So I know that's a bit of an either or this hand, that hand type of answer.
So this is Linda again, and this is sort of not necessarily a follow-up to you, Josh, but it was a question that came in afterwards, that it was about parent involvement, and Linda is apparently a very involved parent. She says, when my children were younger, I was involved in PTA. We had a good relationship with our principals and teachers. They listened to parents, and we used to go to the local school board to advocate for needs identified by the school. I think parents often have felt left out. In the recent governor race, when they had a debate centered around education, the panelists had a variety of people asking questions, but no one identified as parents or PTA was asking questions. When whole language was introduced, so this is an example, right? The example of the controversy around reading pedagogy, right? When whole language was introduced, there was a whole group of children that did not learn to read properly. When we objected and wanted to go back to reading by phonics, which was shown later to be a better way to learn, we were not listened to when we objected to whole language and so much testing. Thoughts about and in particular that example that she says, in some cases parents really felt that, hey, wait a minute, we would like to say something about this, and that sort of schools went ahead and adopted practices, educational pedagogical practices that were later being shown to be really problematic.
Yeah, she's just right. The only thing I would quibble about is I don't think that we even found out later that the brain science was right about foundational skills in early literacy. And this is the premise of a lot of the really excellent reporting by Annalee Hanford, Maryland native, over at American Public Media, is that basically the neuroscientists settled this 30, 40 years ago. They already knew. They said, yeah, like clearly human brains are not wired for reading. We had to invent that later. And so that means you have to learn it in a relatively overt, direct way. You've got to do phonics. That's just it. We definitely have brains wired for language, just not for written language. The point is that the colleges of education that train teachers have kind of still not figured this out. They're only now in the last couple of years being forced to confront it. It's just to say that when Linda says we discovered it later, I mean, like, honestly, she had even more ammunition there back then, empirically, than I think they were letting on.
Yeah. Interesting. Another question from Tina. What are your thoughts, so this is to everybody, on how to engage those most disenfranchised in the context of public education in these conversations?
Yeah.
I think you have to be unique in our education. I think we have to be, as someone who's an educator, I have to think of how I'm going to reach those kids. Mm-hmm. It's my responsibility to make sure when I'm teaching, especially because I am liberal arts theater, when I'm teaching theater, I'm bringing in Shakespeare, I'm bringing in August Wilson, because it's about language and it's about culture and learning different parts of history and about themselves. So it's not just August Wilson. Let's talk about African-American history in America and how it affected your families. And let's talk about European history. Let's talk about Shakespeare. Let's talk about what was going on in the 14th, 15th century. Like, let's actually delve in, learn about these people. So I think it falls on us as educators. And just to speak with Linda, when she said, well, it takes families, there are many families, things have changed today. So most families, pretty much, at least in my area, most families are single families. Mothers are working incredibly long hours. Fathers are working incredibly long hours. There's not always someone home to be able to advocate for their children. I'm not saying, you go to school and you're being babysat. That's not what I'm trying to say, but I think it is a responsibility. One, we set up at home, yes, at some point, to say, this is what you're going to school for. And I expect X, Y, and Z, but not all the kids are going to get that. And then as educators, to really set up that culture within our institutions for our students.
I mean,
yes,
parents and schools are partners, and parents and teachers are partners that need each other. Neither really can succeed without the other. It's something really unique to education as a profession. Our dentist is not a partner with his community, or our accountant. But teaching as a profession is much more tied in and dependent on parents and that community. But that partnership is not an easy one. It's not easy for either side. And we haven't always been great. Neither side has always sort of fulfilled their partnership responsibilities perfectly. So my response to Linda and to this question is, be a good partner. And that goes for schools too. Schools can be better partners. They can recognize that often they're low income and minority parents are uncomfortable in schools. There's a huge power imbalance between teachers and their parents. Now, if you come from an affluent community, you don't sort of think of it that way. You don't feel intimidated by your son's 8th grade English teacher. But for many parents, that's not the case. And they don't show up to sort of parent night meetings, not because they don't care, but because it's not a comfortable space for them. And schools can get, much more thoughtful and proactive about how they make sure that they are creating a welcoming space. Some schools will actually go to parents' homes. They will actually go home by home by home and meet people in their environment, in their space where they're more comfortable. They will bring translators. Very often English is not the first language. But there's a responsibility on the parent side too. A lot of teachers feel under attack. They feel underappreciated. They feel threatened. The public discourse often disrespects them. And parents have to be sensitive about that too, and have to give teachers and schools the benefit of the doubt and assume that most often people are doing the best they can. They're making the best decisions that they think that they're able to, even if they're not perfect. And it's really a joint responsibility because neither side can really succeed without the other.
Excellent. Let me throw one more question that just came in from Eliza. Eliza gives us a disclosure. She's a reporter from Baltimore Fishbowl. Not that should impact on our answers, I think, but she wants to know, how can teachers feel empowered to stand up to groups like Moms for Liberty, who are trying to dictate the substance of what reading material is available for students? And this, I referred to these current controversies a little bit before as well. Any thoughts from the panel?
Well, Bill, we got 15 minutes here?
Maximum. I mean,
no, we have an hour, or we have a minute, right?
Right.
I would say one thing that comes to mind, Eliza, is that I think has been effective in the couple of places I've seen it tried, is to remember that liberty as a value is not univocal. Meaning, liberty can't only mean people standing up for the narrowing of curricula in schools. That can't possibly be what it means to be free. And in the best opposition that I've seen to a lot of this kind of usually astroturfed, heavily funded from some well-to-do conservative philanthropists, is authentic grassroots organizing of moms and parents, dads, families of all different kinds, standing up and saying, look, I want my kid to have the liberty, the freedom to go to a school where they get the full curricula. Like, I don't want them to go to a school where they'll be lied to about American history. I don't want them to go to a school where certain people are just erased from their experience. They need the freedom, the liberty to access the whole of what education can be.
So the answer would be like Moms for Actual Liberty, right?
I mean, really, look, I don't want to trivialize it, but the other thing is, there's even actually, I'm not endorsing, the Century Foundation is a nonpartisan organization, so I won't even mention the parties involved, but there was at one point mostly a messaging bill that went up in Congress that was a parent bill of rights, right, from one side. And it was all sorts of things about the right for your kid to never feel shamed or guilty or whatever. And then there was basically the other party came up with a response bill that said a whole host of parent bill of rights that was actually stuff like the ability to, again, get access to full schools with all of the breadth of diversity that the United States offers, all the breadth of the great Western canon and the broader American and human canon, the canon that's non-Western, all of the great intellectual fervent that comes from elsewhere. That's just to say that there's even a messaging bill out there for you on this.
That sounds great. All right. And Conor, you gave me a very good reminder that we do need to be winding down here. I want to thank the panelists for really a fantastic, robust, stimulating conversation. As we promised our audience, a lot of people tuned in this evening, and I think we did them proud. So thank you, all of you. Shira, I think Eve is going to come back to say some last words here to the group. But in the meantime, audience, thank you for tuning in. Keep your eyes peeled for future announcements from Great Talk. We always come back with great topics for you. So Eve, I'm going to close out and give you the final word.
Thank you, Bill. I really enjoyed this talk very much. I thank all of you for joining us. Really gave a whole new perspective, and it's nice to see that we are moving. It might be slowly, but that we are making some progress and moving in the right direction. And it was wonderful to get the different viewpoints. I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight at Great Talk. I just wanted to remind you that it's, we have talks on all different topics. I encourage you to visit our website, greattalk.org. We are a nonprofit organization. If you liked our talk, feel free to, support us. And I thank you for coming, and thank you, Bill. And I wish you all a really good night. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night.